a Rabbinic Anthology selected with an introduction by C.G. Montefiore and H.Loewe. I think we are in our 5th program for H.Loewe's introduction. While the fall of the temple and the rise of the synagogue eliminated the sacrificial idea from Judaism, in Christianity the idea was radically changed to that of the self-surrender of Jesus on behalf of humanity. Yet they leave in that stuff about how you have to not just claim him as Lord, but do your spiritual work according to who gave him the doctrine. Hence, the blood theme tended to be symbolized as a vivid expression of the ultimate truth of a consecration of life to God, even at the cost of death. Canon Knox. This idea of consecration by martyrdom is called, in Judaism, Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of the name. See page 261. Owing to the fact that Jewish sentiment bans pictorial representations in worship, while Christian sentiment regards them as devotional aids, it has come about that the Christian worshiper, by means of pictures and reliefs, is made familiar with the suffering, death, and blood of the crucifixion story in forms that are sometimes exceedingly realistic. There is absolutely nothing to correspond to this on the Jewish side, and the connection of blood with worship is utterly inconceivable to a Jew. True, on Passover night, we repeat the words of Akiba the martyr, who, praying for the messianic advent, besought God that our eyes might behold the blood of animals dripping at the rebuilt altar. The prayer is too old, too deeply fraught with meaning to be dropped as the liberals do, but we say it in a different sense, giving the words the wider meaning which their author intended. In this there is no intellectual dishonesty. Just in the same way do Christians, repeating the creed, assert their belief in the resurrection of the body when they actually mean the survival of the soul. Now, one of the things that we should regard is that every time in this era that the Muslimin have gained control of Jerusalem, they gave the Jews the opportunity to reopen their temple rights and such. They didn't hold them back. In fact, they even helped them towards reestablishing them by, clearing up the scene. Even hell is not that bad after they, made the place more accessible rather than a burning garbage heap. Gehenna is, just south of Jerusalem. Or again, one thinks of the phrase in the litany, by thy bloody sweat deliver us. It is not here a question whether a Jew can ever comprehend the Christian idea of God suffering physical. It is rather a question of the emphasized use of the metaphor of blood. Here, as in the common wine, one has known types of exegesis and worship that seem to concentrate on the physical. There is Cowper's hymn of the fountain of blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and on the High Church side there are parallels. As an example, the rock tomb in Walsingham may be cited. At that shrine there is a garden and a chapel of which the aesthetic beauty and spiritual purpose are unspeakably wonderful, Every scene in the life of Jesus is most feelingly, most devoutly represented, and then the climax is a rock tomb containing a life-size recumbent model of the bleeding body of Jesus that concentrates on the horror of mangled flesh and gore. It is true that many a French Calvary are in Italian primitive represents blood vividly. My point is that it is the degree of realism which counts. This, no doubt, is a purely personal opinion, but the fact remains that here at Walsingham, a body of men of the highest piety have carried the blood theme to the furthest lengths imaginable. That is what matters. I feel that there is always has been, and possibly always will be, even in the best of us, a concentration on blood which I, for my part, call unhealthy. But in view of the saintly character of those who think otherwise, I am prepared to admit that my attitude is subjective, and that it is wrong does not necessarily follow. We must remember that when we are considering martyrdom, be it Jewish or Christian, the bloody thing may be used as a vivid expression of the ultimate truth of a consecration of a life to God, even at the cost of death. These words are already cited previously, are those of Canon Knox, who has kindly discussed this point with me. He goes on to say, in Christian devotion, it would be easy to find expressions in art or language which might suggest a morbid concentration on the horror of blood. Actually, these are no more than conventional expressions. This view of Canon Knox seems, if one may say so, eminently sound. It is akin to the Jewish side, to what some may hold today who take Akiba's words in the Passover service in their literal sense, but it is not the only view. Several of my Christian friends feel that such representations as that in Walsingham do imply an undue emphasis on blood. It is noteworthy that Jewish art, which is, in the main, verbal, eschews blood. The poetical dirges recounting the deaths of martyrs narrate them without elaboration. The iron combs that tore Akiba's flesh from him are mentioned in the Ella Ezkra, but details are left to the imagination. Pictures or reliefs of them would be unthinkable, even when the sentence on criminals such as Haman's 10 sons are soon to be. Well, they left out the chapters of the book of Esther that about her Genesis. Well, Esther committed the genocide. And so there's a counter Purim celebration in Persia where they celebrate surviving this great wicked Queen Esther, who killed 78,000 of her who had 78,000 of her people of their people killed. Is carried out so far. From there being any gloating, the reader has to rush the sentence through in one breath. Such a phrase as "the blood is the life" is not the motif of hymns. Here and there, in a stray Silitcha on the Day of Atonement, one may come upon such a thought as, "May my flesh and fat, diminished by fasting, be accounted as a burnt offering." But such ideas are few and far between. They belong to the hymnal and have no authority. They are due to the taste prevailing in the Middle Ages when they were written, and they may be and often are dropped today. But the circumstance that we find these two views about blood strong and vigorous today helps us to understand the question with which we started and solves Mr. Montefiore's first paradox, so we can realize that there could be men, great and good men, who found no difficulty in believing that God liked blood. To them, the spectacle of blood streaming from the altar was as natural a theme of worship and devotion as is the Walsingham tomb today. To the great and good men who created it, every human institution can be judged in two ways. Its essential soul may be obvious to some, whom it raises to God, but incomprehensible to others, to whom it is empty and meaningless. Some see only its faults, if faults there be, others its values. Judgment is subjective and even biased. So is it with Walsingham, so is it with the Jewish institutions. To some, circumcision suggests totemism, initiation rites, mutilation, a relic from the Stone Age. Well, actually, it would have not been as old of a practice, but initiation, a lot of cultures waited to puberty, or at least some other period where a person would remember the horrors of ritual genital mutilation. Of course, the 8th day of life is the day where the damage done is the least. You know, the permanent effects, you heal better and stuff like this on that day versus any other, apparently. And there's scientific studies to back that up, but we're not advocating ritual genital mutilation on this channel. To others, it is a sacred covenant sealed in the flesh, typifying the subjugation of passion and the consecration of the body. To institutions sacred to ourselves, we must apply the same moral standards as we use in considering those sacred to others, and we must view their institutions with that sympathy which we extend to our own. So too is it the case with sacrifices. These often stand, as we have seen, for a symbol. We must remember all that the sacrificial system implied to those who lived while it prevailed. It will not do to isolate one feature that is so prominent to us. It must also be borne in mind that, as Mr. Montefiore says, 111, I guess the note to it, right? The rabbis who took the system for granted also knew by heart the prophetical passages that were opposed to sacrifices and used them liturgically as a counterweight. Well, were those passages opposed to it, or are they just making the point that obedience is better and don't expect to pay for your sins as some sort of thing? It's better to not do stuff and to do stuff rather than, because I don't think there are any passages that actually are opposed to sacrifice in itself. And, of course, there's that thing about the unaccepted sacrifice. Again, you want to have the intention and offer the best and that sort of stuff, or at least something that fits the terms. The end of Menachat is a useful illustration of this tendency, but see also my remarks on the choice of the Haftarah to Tazau in note 74, the stress laid on Hosea 14 verse 2, we will render the service of our life for calves, which occurs so frequently in the penitential services, 897, 909, 904, 902, 951, is very heavy. Again, the sacrificial theme was often utilized as a homiletic vehicle for teaching ethical conduct, 1145, and including charity. He who gives to the poor gives to God. But did not the sacrificial system tend to make man callous to suffering and in consequence cruel to animals? Well, no, because the animal cruelty was never considered an acceptable part of the sacrifice. Canon Knox is kind enough to remind me that Theophrastus stood alone in his attitude to animals in the ancient world, and that we must not look for modern ideas in early times. Now, one can't be familiar with every figure, but I thought that Canon Knox was John Knox, one of the Protestant leaders back in the day, but definitely not a contemporary in the 1930s. So, different individual. Maybe a cardinal? I don't know why they call him Canon. If we say that it is cruel to kill animals for food, then the answer must be yes. Well, look at how they do that in the, non-halal, non-kosher, the secular world. Yeah. But no one who eats meat is entitled to ask the question, for in that sense, he is as cruel as the man who offered a paschal lamb. If, however, we exclude the slaughter of animals for food, regarding it as a thing apart, and take the phrase cruelty to mean the infliction of wanton suffering, then the answer is no. It is noteworthy that the utmost case was taken to prevent animals from being ill-treated. There was a documentary, Hitler, the Friend of Animals. Tsar Baal Chayim, cruelty to anything possessed of life was a crime, 123 to 124. He outlawed basically the Western modern way of slaughtering animals. That wasn't just modern, but because you can beat a pig with a billy club, and you can electrocute animals and drug them to death and drag them with machines and all sorts of stuff if it's not done in a religious context. But if it's done in a religious context, it's some sort of a crime. Of course, animal slaughter is perfectly legal if it's your own animal, It can't be like that thing, with some of those Haitians that they were talking about on the news. But of course, in Haitian culture, you don't steal other people's animals to do sacrifice. That's not, people go after you for that, so they don't accept that. The slaughter of beasts for food was hedged by the most elaborate precautions to minimize, if not to suppress, pain completely. To eat a limb of the living animal was regarded as a mark of barbarism. Today, eels are still skinned alive. Cod is crimped, and lobsters are boiled unpithed. It is remarkable that Jews did not kill animals for sport. Fish had to be netted. Mr. William Radcliffe, in his great book, Fishing from the Earliest Times, London 1921, blames Jews for lacking the sporting spirit. They caught fish by the net. They did not play them with the rod. This is perfectly true. The word hook occurs in the Bible only as a metaphor of cruelty, or as an instrument used by foreigners. In rabbinic times, the hook which entered the mouth of the fish typified cruelty, and with it was compared the terrible disease of croup, which similarly attacks and chokes infants. This was the evil net of Ecclesiastes 9:12. See Ecclesiastes R in Loke. It can safely be said that the system of sacrifices did not promote cruelty to animals, a fault from which Jews have been remarkably free. Nevertheless, this last statement which is commonly repeated, must not be exaggerated. It is somewhat of an overstatement on the part of Dr. Cecil Roth to say that the RSPCA owes its very existence, as well as its inspiration, to a professing Jew, just as it is equally unfair of the society today to decry, if not to deny altogether, Gompertz's share in its original creation, and the present society acts very unworthily in repudiating its just debt. The truth lies midway. The services of Gompertz were very great. He was a pioneer and indefatigable, but he was not the only one to whom the society owed its existence. Again, Dr. Roth further says, page 299 of the Jewish Contribution to Civilization, London, 1938, that in regard to care for animals, the Old Testament is in advance of the New. His proof in the contrast between Deuteronomy 25:4, thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn, and by corn they mean grain, but nowadays we can apply that to the thing that was discovered in America. And 1 Corinthians 9:9, doth God care for oxen? It is true that the contrast is not his, but Paul's. Yet such contrasts of specially selected verses lead nowhere. One thinks instinctively of others. See Matthew 10:29, not one sparrow shall fall to the ground without your Father. That love for animals has always been strong among Jews is undeniable and needs no demonstration. Still less does it need advocacy on a partisan basis. Such advocacy is often the outcome of an inferiority complex. We now come to the second paradox to which Mr. Montefiore has drawn attention, that God, who loves all mankind, can consign Gentiles and Massa to hell. Well, it depends on what we need. If we say that, like for example, in Arabic they have Gawin, it doesn't have the implication, for example, as Guya being the singular in Aramaic, biblical Hebrew as they call it, one who turned their back on God. So the word God isn't explicitly part of the term, just like Mujahideen being equivalent to Israel. But definitely it's a choice thing. So it would make sense to the Gentiles, whether they be atheists or those who turn their back on God or other such terms. It makes sense, and of course secularist would be included too. So you can't, that being a Jew wouldn't have saved you. Here, Mr. Montefiore has really raised two unreal alternatives. First, it must be said that consigning Gentiles to hell is not consigning them to eternal punishment, since the locus classicus, RH 17a, also Uduyat 2:10, and so on, says that the punishment of the wicked, whoever they be in hell, is limited to 12 months. Rabbinic speculation, obviously. And when R. Joseph in the 2nd century interpreted the last verse of Isaiah to mean that hell existed forever, Tosh Bear 6:7, ZP 14, line 7, this may just as well imply that, so long as the world endures, hell will be needed for successive generations of sinners, as that the individual sinner's punishment was to be eternal. In any case, whatever view be adopted, it can first be said that certain rabbis did not believe that all Gentiles would be sent to hell forever, but that sinners would be sent there for 12 months. And secondly, that Israelite sinners would also suffer. Naturally, at different times and in different places, different views prevailed according to the environment. And that kind of shouldn't be it. Religion should be beyond the material and psychological culture inflections. A rabbi who lived in completely vicious surroundings among Gentiles, addicted to murder and bestiality, and devoid of finer feelings, might well be tempted to draw categorical conclusions as to the utter baseness of the Gentile nature. Now, what was the rabbinic quote about how it's better to have sex with an animal than a Gentile that's 9 years old or older, or over 9, or so there's no real link to a non-Jew somehow, that's. But I have yet to meet a statement which declares, sans phrase, that all Gentiles go automatically to hell. The fact that unkind suggestions are occasionally found does not justify so strong an indictment as that with which we started note 75. 4. Halakha. On page 16, Mr. Montefiore correctly points out the immense range and influence of halakha. He remarks that it lacks arrangement and that it is jumbled. This is partly true. The lack of arrangement strikes us immediately and forcibly. Yet to the specialist of the past, and even to the specialist today, the path through the jungle is quite clear. The reason is that halakha was for long periods preserved orally. To write down even the formula for benedictions was tantamount to burning the Torah. Sab 115b. The same is said of halakot, tem 14b, for reduction to writing tends to deaden. The letter killeth. Is this why the early gospel stories circulated by word of mouth, and why Q.R. Marcus seems to have so many forms? The same may be said of the logia, for the writers of halakha have no share in the world to come. Neither the preacher who reads Haggadah from a book, nor the hearer derives profit. J. Sab 14.5, folio 15c, line 38, Jerusalem Talmud. Hence, the stress on daily repetition. Thou shalt teach incisively, veshin nantam, in the Shema, was taken as though the root were shana and not shanan, and rendered, thou shalt repeat them daily. Hence, to assist memory, numerous mnemonics were introduced. It is the principle of association by catchwords or outstanding features that rendered oral preservation possible. It is this very device that makes halakha look jumbled. If one groups together all things that go in tens, for example, Ethics chapter 5, PB page 199, they will be easy to recall to mind, but they will present a strange appearance on the printed page. In the same way, we might speak of the 4 Georges, 4 farthings make a penny, 4 parts of the British Isles, the 4 seasons, the big 4 railways, the 4 quarter days, etc. This method would now be as absurd as it was useful formerly, because we have invented the index. What should we do without an index to a book? Nevertheless, though we may possess orderly arrangements, we prefer shortcuts. Bradshaw is a model of orderly arrangement, yet when we are in a hurry, we turn to the ABC. Halakha could be more lively and more capable of development so long as it was oral. The written code is orderly, but it is rigid. We have a striking example in the latest code of all, the Shulchan Aruch. As Abrahams used to point out, this was the first code produced after the invention of printing. It has been the last. Its sway is unchallenged. The great good it has achieved in establishing uniformity is counterbalanced by its bar to progress. No such danger existed in Talmudic times. When halakha was fluid, the price we pay for such fluidity is the jumble. On page XVII, Mr. Montefiore says, or an XCIV, that if the whole mass of halakha disappeared, archaeology, etc., would be the poorer, but religious life would hardly have suffered a loss. This statement, it seems to me, tends to make halakha purely legal and divest it of its ethical elements. It is difficult to make an accurate division and say that such a concept falls on one side of the line rather than on the other. But if we take such a subject as ona'ah, of which numerous examples are given, page 403, CPFF, we can divorce this either from halakha, since it is argued with much casuistry, or from Haggadah, since it is so vitally ethical. When do the minutiae of Sabbath observance cease to be halakhic and become Haggadic? When their effort is unmistakably ethical and not legal. But unmistakable to whom? The decision is subjective. To some extent, Mr. Montefiore is right, but I plead for a qualifying clause. See the footnote. Halakha is a necessary discipline for life. In his new commentary to Ezekiel, Professor Cook says, page VI, the discipline of ordered right and obligation is needed to train the spiritual outlook and to save prophecy from self-will and the empty fate of dreams. Law needs accurate terminology, definite provisions. In the propounding of abstract principles, precision is uncalled for. In fixing rules of conduct, there is no room for vagueness. The late Sir George Lewis used to remark that if a marriage settlement were drawn up on the assumption that all the parties concerned were decent people, the seeds of trouble in the future were planted. If the assumption were that all the parties were rogues, no trouble ever could occur that could not be settled promptly and amicably. In Europe today, gentlemen's agreements are not particularly successful. There is something to be said for the thoroughgoing precision of the Victorian Foreign Office. Bylaws are not a burden, they are essential. Yet dull, they certainly are. No one would take as his light reading a memorandum on public health or a report on the administration of local option. One cannot make an entertaining anthology out of blue books or local government bylaws. In his choice of material, Mr. Montefiore was clearly right. Yet, in the past, history shows no such clash. Legislation and mysticism could go hand in hand. Safed could produce both poetry and law books. Kabbalah and codes, as Schechter in his famous essay has demonstrated. It is scarcely necessary to remind the reader that the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Joseph Caro himself, was a profound mystic, for the fact is commonplace, and Caro was far from being exceptional in this respect. The dialectics which Halakha involved made up to no small extent for the lack of philosophy. The rabbis were no philosophers, chapter C 8 and 737, and as Mr. Montefiore says, their outlook was limited, page XIX and XLII. They had but a casual acquaintance with Greek thought, Judaism, Christianity, Volume 1, 121. This profound system of logical discussion was a substitute. Till the present day, it has served to sharpen the wits of the youths taught in the cheder, where the curriculum was limited almost exclusively to rabbinic subjects. But it is true that Haggadah has always been more popular than Halakha. See the same source, Volume 1, page 140. For Mr. Montefiore's remarks on legalism, page XXXVI, see page 273.